October 15th, 1880. Dawn mist clung to Blue Rock's muddy streets like the ghost of better times, but Hazel Field could see through its gray veil to the ugly truth gathering in the square. At 18, she had imagined many futures for herself: marriage to a decent man, children playing in the meadows by Wind River, maybe even teaching school like Miss Carrington. They secured a license from the county clerk, with a U.S. Indian agent noting the union to avoid later disputes between territorial and tribal law. None of those dreams had included being dragged from her bed at 5 in the morning to face a whipping post like some common criminal. The hemp rope cut deep into her wrists as Dusty Bill positioned her against the weathered oak post outside Murphy's livery. Each strand felt like a brand against her skin, marking her as property to be corrected rather than a human being with rights. Her calico dress, carefully mended just yesterday evening. Papa always said a woman should take pride in her appearance, no matter the circumstances, now hung torn where Bill's meaty hands had yanked her into position. But it was the brass locket pressing against her throat that truly anchored her papa's final gift. Warm from her body heat, and heavy with secrets she was only beginning to understand. Terror clawed at her ribs like a living thing, each heartbeat a hammer blow against her chest. She had seen Bill's handiwork before, had tended the wounds of girls who came down from the mine with stories they were too frightened to tell. The whip in his scarred hands could lay a man's back open to the bone, and he took pride in his precision. She could imagine Papa's voice steady and reassuring. Fear is natural, Hazel girl, but it doesn't have to be master. Control what you can control: your eyes, your voice, your dignity. But fear showed first in the eyes. Papa had always said then in the voice. If she could control both, she might survive this with some dignity intact. 20 yards away, another pair of eyes watched with different intensity altogether. Mape crouched in the narrow alley between the blacksmith shop and Henderson's store, his weathered buckskin coat blending into the morning shadows. At 23, he carried the controlled stillness of a predator, every muscle coiled for action, while his dark eyes assessed threats and calculated angles. The tactical situation was hopeless: one man against an entire hostile town, with no backup and no clear escape route. His mission was specific and urgent: find Ayanna, rescue her, return to their people before winter closed the high passes. Every moment spent on anything else reduced his chances of success. His sister was counting on him, and their family band was counting on him, and getting involved in local disputes could ruin everything. But watching this young woman tied to that post, seeing her struggle to maintain dignity in the face of brutal punishment, he felt a recognition that went deeper than tactical assessment. This was courage under fire, the same fierce independence that marked Ayanna's spirit. This woman was fighting a battle she couldn't win, but she was fighting nonetheless. And that made her worthy of respect, maybe even aid. The internal struggle lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Duty warred with honor, practical considerations with moral imperatives. In the end, his grandmother's words settled the matter. A warrior who refuses to protect the innocent is no warrior at all. This is proper extrajudicial punishment under color of office, in truth, a private assault. Sheriff Tom Hadley announced, his voice cutting through the fog with practiced authority. Rain from the night storm still dripped from his hat brim, but his pale blue eyes, an unusual shade that seemed almost familiar, though Mape couldn't place where he'd seen such coloring before, remained cold and steady. Miss Field refused a lawful marriage proposal backed by legitimate debt. Tom continued, leaning against his Springfield rifle with casual confidence. Territorial law permits correction of such defiance. Dusty Bill circled Hazel like a buzzard, sizing up Carrion, the braided rawhide whip coiled in his scarred hands. He was a man who had found his calling in other people's pain, hired specifically for his willingness to enforce discipline without question or mercy. 20 lashes for defying proper authority. Bill called out his voice, carrying over the murmur of the crowd. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the Wind River Range. The first lash came without warning. The braided leather cracked through the morning air with the sound of a rifle shot biting deep across her shoulder blades through the thin fabric of her dress. Pain exploded through her body like liquid fire radiating from the point of impact to flood every nerve ending. The force sent her stumbling forward against the post rope, cutting deeper into her wrists as her knees buckled. Don't give them the satisfaction, she told herself, remembering Papa's stories about captured soldiers who refused to break under interrogation. You're a field. We don't break. But the scream tore from her throat anyway. A sound of pure anguish that echoed off the false-fronted buildings and sent several women in the crowd turning away in disgust. 1. Bill counted with obvious satisfaction, studying the red welt already rising through her torn dress. Through the haze of pain, Hazel pressed her forehead against the rough oak. The wood smelled of rain and years of weather, and she found herself thinking of Papa's hands, gentle as he taught her to read strong, as he showed her how to use a rifle. Endure, his voice whispered in her memory. This too shall pass. Through her pain-blurred vision, she became aware of movement at the edge of the square. A figure stepping forward from the shadows between buildings, tall, moving with fluid grace. Long black hair, braided simply with a single eagle feather, weathered buckskin coat, bearing the stains of hard travel. Something in his bearing spoke of controlled violence, like a wolf deciding whether to attack or withdraw. The second lash crossed the first at a vicious angle, opening new wounds and drawing a line of fire from her shoulder to her spine. This time, Hazel managed to bite back her scream, though her whole body shook with the effort. Blood was flowing freely now, staining her dress in spreading patches of crimson. She could taste copper in her mouth. Where she'd bitten her tongue, could feel consciousness threatening to slip away from the pain. Stay awake, she commanded herself. Papa would stay awake. 2, Bill announced, positioning himself for the third strike. He was taking his time, savoring both her suffering and the crowd's horrified fascination. That was when Mahpe stepped into the square, his hand outstretched to intercept the descending whip. The braided leather wrapped around his palm with a wet slap, cutting deep enough to draw blood. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he wrapped the whip around his fist with deliberate slowness and looked directly into Bill's startled face. She's already taken, he said, his voice low and level, carrying authority that needed no amplification. The mist seemed to thicken in the sudden silence, muffling sounds and creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Mahpe stepped closer to Hazel, placing his free hand gently but firmly on her shoulder, a touch that lasted only a moment, but conveyed both protection and solidarity. Their eyes met as she turned her head slightly toward him. Hers were wide with pain and shock, but also with something that might have been hope. His remained steady and unreadable, but she could see the controlled anger in the slight tension around his eyes, and something else, a recognition of shared strength, of kindred spirits facing the same kind of implacable enemy. For a heartbeat, the pain receded enough for her to truly see him. Not just another drifter or troublemaker, but someone who understood what it meant to stand alone against impossible odds. Someone who had chosen to stand with her. You got no business here, Redskin. Bill snarled, jerking the whip, but finding it held fast in Mahpe's iron grip. This is white man's justice. The woman says she owes no debt, Mahpe replied quietly. I heard her say it plain enough. He released the whip, suddenly causing Bill to stumble backward into the mud. If there's debt, show the paper. If there's no paper, there's no debt. Sheriff Tom pushed himself away from the building's support post, thumbing back the hammer of his rifle with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere. Around the square, other weapons appeared as if by magic, rifle barrels sliding through windows, hands drifting toward gun belts, the familiar preparations for frontier violence. "You're interfering with territorial law, boy," Tom said, his voice carrying a strange undertone of personal satisfaction. "That's a hanging offense in these parts." The first shot came from the direction of the saloon, a wild round that sparked off the blacksmith's anvil and sent orange sparks flying into the morning gloom. The metallic tang of gunpowder began to mingle with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. It was followed immediately by another from across the street, this one, punching through a window and sending glass cascading onto the boardwalk with a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Dang it!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Who's doing the shooting?" More shots followed in rapid succession, muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies in the fog. Most were aimed high warning shots, rather than killing attempts, but the effect was to transform the quiet morning into chaos. People screamed and dove for cover, while horses reared and fought their tethers, adding the sharp scent of horse sweat and fear to the acrid cloud of gunpowder smoke that was beginning to fill the square. Moppy tackled Hazel to the muddy ground as bullets began flying from multiple directions, his body shielding hers from the crossfire. She cried out as her wounded back hit the churned earth, fresh pain lancing through her torn flesh, but his weight pressing down on her was warm and solid and reassuring. "Stay down," he whispered urgently, his face inches from hers, as lead sang overhead with the angry buzz of hornets. His breath was warm against her ear, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Don't move until I say." For a moment that seemed to last forever, they lay pressed together in the mud while gunfire erupted around them. She could feel his heart beating against her ribs, strong and steady, could smell the leather and wood smoke scent of his coat, mixed with the metallic tang of his blood from the whip cut. The cold mud seeped through her torn dress, but his body heat kept the worst of the chill at bay. When their eyes met in the space between one bullet and the next, something passed between them that had nothing to do with the danger and everything to do with sudden understanding that neither was facing this alone anymore. In his dark eyes, she saw not pity, but recognition. Warrior acknowledging warrior strength, recognizing strength. A bullet whined off the whipping post just inches above their heads, showering them with splinters of oak. Another kicked up mud near Moppy's leg, close enough that he could feel the wind of its passage. The acrid smell of gunpowder was making her eyes water, but she kept them fixed on his face, drawing strength from his calm. The courthouse. Tom was shouting over the chaos, his voice barely audible above the crack of rifles and the screams of frightened horses. "Get to the courthouse and we'll settle this legal." But his words were nearly drowned out by the sustained crackle of gunfire. What had started as scattered warning shots was escalating into a full battle with muzzle flashes, visible from windows, doorways, and rooftops around the square. The fog made it impossible to identify specific shooters, but the volume of fire suggested that significant portions of the town had chosen sides. A ricocheting bullet caught one of Tom's deputies in the thigh, sending him spinning to the ground with a curse that was equal parts pain and surprise. Blood began to pool in the mud beneath his leg as he dragged himself behind cover. Another shot, this one clearly aimed, punched through the crown of Bill's hat and sent him diving behind a water trough with his whip abandoned in the mud. "Yeller-bellied snake," someone shouted from the direction of the mercantile, the voice barely audible over the continuing gunfire. "Come out and fight like a man." The battle raged for nearly 15 minutes, with scattered shots echoing off the buildings and people shouting from concealment. The air grew thick with powder smoke, and spent brass began to litter the muddy square like deadly confetti. But gradually, the firing died away, as ammunition ran low and it became clear that no one had clear targets in the swirling fog. When silence finally returned to the square, Sheriff Tom was nowhere to be seen. His rifle lay abandoned beside the water trough, and his badge glinted in the mud, where he had dropped it during his hasty retreat to parts unknown. Dr. Cormack emerged from his office, carrying his black bag, his weathered face grim, as he surveyed the battlefield that had been Blue Rock's main square. Behind him came Winifred Carrington and several other citizens, who had apparently decided that morning's events marked a turning point in their town's history. "Let me see to those wounds." Dr. Cormack said, his Scottish accent thick with concern, as he knelt beside Hazel. His weathered hands were gentle as he examined the lash marks through her torn dress, but his face darkened with anger at what he found. The cuts were deep enough to require stitches and already showing signs of inflammation. As he worked to clean and bandage her injuries with supplies from his medical bag, Winifred approached Mape with a folded piece of paper hidden in her palm. "Can you read English?" she asked quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. At his nod, she pressed the paper into his hand. "Meet me behind the schoolhouse at 9 o'clock. Come alone and tell no one. There are things you need to know about why you're really here." The note, when Mape had a chance to read it privately, contained only an address and a single word: Ayanna. His sister's name written in a feminine hand that clearly belonged to someone who knew more about his presence in Blue Rock than should have been possible. At 9 o'clock precisely, Mape made his way to the schoolhouse and found Winifred waiting in the shadow of the woodshed behind the building. The morning sun had finally burned away, most of the fog revealing the mountains sharp and clear against the October sky. But she wasn't alone. Dr. Cormack stood beside her, along with a woman Mape didn't recognize. The stranger was perhaps 50 years old, small and neat, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and there was something in her bearing that suggested capabilities beyond those of a typical frontier housewife. Her hands, Mape noticed, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to handling tools and weapons. "This is Martha Field," Winifred said without preamble. "Hazel's mother and someone you need to meet." Martha stepped forward, studying Mape with obvious interest. Her gaze was direct and assessing the look of someone who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "You're the one who stopped the whipping," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. That tells me something about your character." She reached into her coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. "I believe this belongs to your sister." The cloth contained a beaded hair ornament in the traditional Lakota style, worked with symbols Mape recognized immediately. It had belonged to Ayanna since childhood, a gift from their grandmother before her death. He could still remember the old woman's gnarled fingers as she worked the intricate patterns, telling stories of their ancestors with each bead. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "From a girl who escaped from the mine 3 nights ago," Dr. Cormack replied, his Scottish accent softening with sympathy. "Half dead from exposure and fear, but alive. She managed to tell us a few things before Leopold's men found her and took her back." "Leopold Strauss," Martha said, her voice carrying undertones of personal hatred that spoke of old wounds and unfinished business. "Austrian immigrant who owns the Ash River mine and most of the corrupt officials in this territory. He's been running what amounts to a slavery operation for the past 2 years, taking women from isolated areas and forcing them to work in his ore sorting facilities." She spread a rough map on the ground between them, marked with details that spoke of careful reconnaissance and professional intelligence gathering. The paper was worn from handling, and the notations were made in different hands, suggesting this had been a collaborative effort over time. My husband was investigating Leopold's crimes when he died last winter. Martha continued, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly as she pointed to various locations on the map. Officially, he died of pneumonia. Unofficially, he was murdered to prevent him from exposing the whole network. Your husband was a lawman. Detective, Martha corrected. Territorial government hired him to investigate reports of missing women along the frontier. He'd been building a case against Leopold for months when he took sick. She paused, collecting herself. I helped him with the investigation. Women could go places and hear things that men couldn't. We worked as a team. There was pain in her voice, but also something harder and more dangerous. This was a woman who had lost someone important and was looking for justice or failing that revenge. The debt papers Tom used against your daughter, Mahpe said, understanding beginning to dawn. They're connected to your husband's investigation. Forged, Martha confirmed. Leopold needed our water rights for his mining operation, so he manufactured a debt and corrupted Tom to enforce it. Kill two birds with one stone, get the water rights, and eliminate the family of his most dangerous investigator. Dr. Cormack leaned forward, his weathered face grave. There's more. Tom Hadley isn't just a corrupt sheriff, he's Leopold's brother. Tom Strauss, operating under an assumed name to provide legal cover for the family business. That's why he was so personally invested in this morning's punishment. The revelation clicked into place with all the other clues Mahpe had been unconsciously collecting. The unusual eye color, the coordinated corruption, the personal satisfaction in Tom's voice when he'd threatened Hazel, it all made sense now. What do you want from me? Mahpe asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Help, Winifred said simply. We know where your sister is being held, but we can't reach her without tactical skills that none of us possess. The terrain is treacherous, the security is professional, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If we're caught, Martha added quietly, they'll kill us all and dispose of the evidence. But if we do nothing more, women will disappear and Leopold's network will continue to spread. You help us expose Leopold's operation and rescue the women, Dr. Cormack said, and we help you get Ayanna back safely. More than that, we have evidence that could bring down his entire network from here to Chicago. And if Leopold discovers what we're planning, then we all die, Dr. Cormack said matter-of-factly. But at least we'll die fighting for something that matters. And sometimes that's the only choice that lets a person sleep at night. The silence stretched between them as Mahpe weighed the options. The smart play would be to decline their offer, find another way to rescue Ayanna that didn't involve local complications. His mission was specific and urgent, and getting involved in a larger conspiracy could ruin everything. But as he looked at the faces around him, people who were willing to risk everything for the sake of justice, he felt the same stirring in his chest that had prompted him to step between Hazel and the whip. Sometimes, honor mattered more than survival. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, honor and survival could be made to work together. When do we start? He asked. Martha's smile was fierce and proud. We already have. By afternoon, they had developed a plan that was risky but straightforward in its essential elements. The intelligence Martha and her late husband had gathered over months of investigation provided detailed information about Leopold's operation, but it would require careful timing and considerable courage to put into action. Martha would remain in town to coordinate and watch for Tom's return. His sudden disappearance during the morning's gunfight suggested he was regrouping rather than retreating. She would also serve as a communication link with any federal authorities who might be willing to act on evidence of Leopold's crimes. Dr. Cormack would prepare medical supplies and arrange for the care of rescued women who might be in poor health after months of captivity. Meanwhile, Mahpe and Hazel would use her knowledge of the local terrain to reach the hidden caves where the women were being held. If they could gather proof of the illegal operation and rescue at least some of the captives, it might be enough to bring down Leopold's entire network. "The risks are considerable," Martha said as they reviewed the final details of their plan. "If Leopold suspects we're coming, he'll move the women or eliminate them entirely. We'll have one chance to get this right. I can get you within a quarter-mile of the caves without being seen." Hazel promised, studying Martha's map despite the obvious pain from her lash wounds. Her back was stiff with bandages, and she moved carefully to avoid reopening the cuts. "There's an old logging road that cuts through the forest on the north side of the ridge. Papa showed it to me when I was 12, said it was a secret worth keeping." "What about your injuries?" Mahpe asked, noting the careful way she held herself and the lines of pain around her eyes. "I'll manage," she replied with a kind of stubborn determination that was clearly a family trait. "These women have been suffering for months. I can handle a few lash marks for a few hours." She looked up at him with green eyes that held no compromise. "Besides, you'll need someone who knows every deer path and hiding place in those hills. That's me, injuries or not." As they prepared to leave the schoolhouse and begin their mission, Dr. Cormack caught Mahpe's arm with an urgent grip. "There's something else you need to know," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Something we didn't want to say in front of the women, but you'll need to be prepared for it." "What?" "The girl who escaped 3 nights ago." Dr. Cormack continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She died this morning, officially from her injuries and exposure, but I examined the body. She was poisoned, something administered within the last few hours, probably while she was under medical care in my own clinic." The implications were staggering. If Leopold's reach extended into the doctor's own clinic, if he had agents willing to murder wounded girls to protect the operation's secrets, then nowhere in Blue Rock was truly safe. "Who else knows about this?" Mahpe asked. "Just you and me," Dr. Cormack replied. "I haven't even told Martha yet, didn't want to add to her burden. But you needed to know what kind of people you're dealing with. They're not just criminals, they're killers who'll stop at nothing to protect their operation." As they left the schoolhouse and began preparing for the journey up Ash River Ridge, Mahpe found himself looking at the mission with new eyes. This wasn't just a rescue operation anymore. It was a race against time to expose Leopold's crimes before more innocent people died to keep his secret safe. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a cold voice was whispering that they might already be too late. At 11 o'clock that morning, as the sun finally burned away, the last of the mist, and revealed the mountains sharp and clear against the October sky, Mahpe and Hazel set out for what might be their final adventure together. Behind them, Blue Rock settled into an uneasy quiet, like a town holding its breath before a storm. The old logging road that wound up the eastern face of Ash River Ridge was treacherous, even in good weather, carved through forbidding terrain by necessity rather than engineering. October's early storms had made it worse, washing out sections of the roadbed and sending rock slides cascading down from the canyon walls above. The air grew thinner as they climbed, and the temperature dropped noticeably with each mile of elevation gained. But it was perfect for their purposes, too rough for wagons, too narrow for cavalry, and completely invisible from the main approaches to the mine. More importantly, it was a route Hazel had traveled dozens of times during hunting expeditions with her father, back when the biggest danger in these hills had been the occasional mountain lion or grizzly bear. She rode in the lead despite her injuries, her intimate knowledge of the terrain allowing her to pick the safest path through the maze of deadfalls and erosion gullies. Behind her, Mape kept watch for pursuit, while studying the intelligence Martha had provided, committing guard positions and building layouts to memory, with the professional thoroughness of someone whose life might depend on such details. "Tell me about your sister," Hazel said quietly as they paused to rest the horses beside a mountain stream. The water ran clear and cold, and both animals drank gratefully after the hard climb. Mahpe considered the question, watching the play of sunlight on the water. "Ayana means eternal flower in our language," he said finally. It suited her from the beginning, beautiful but stubborn as a weed when she set her mind to something. She was always the one asking questions the elders didn't want to answer, always pushing boundaries. "Sounds familiar," Hazel said with a slight smile. "Papa used to say I inherited his curiosity and Mama's stubborn streak. Not always a comfortable combination. For her or for everyone else? Both." Hazel adjusted her position carefully, mindful of the healing lash marks on her back. What was she doing when they took her? Helping with the winter preparations. Our band was small, only about 30 people, and everyone had to contribute. She was working with the other young women to prepare hides for winter clothing when the raiders came. Mape's voice tightened with remembered pain. "I was hunting with my uncle 3 days' ride away. By the time we got back, the camp was burned and 5 women were missing. Including Ayana. The trail led south, but it was made to look like the work of rival tribes. Too convenient, too obvious. Real war parties don't leave such clear signs of their passage. They rode in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, as the trail wound higher into the mountains. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant low through the trees, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. They had been climbing for 3 hours when Hazel called a halt beside a creek that cascaded down the mountainside in a series of foam-white waterfalls. The horses needed rest and water, and both riders needed a chance to study the terrain ahead and finalize their approach to the hidden caves. "How much further?" Mape asked, dismounting to let his horse drink from the creek. "Maybe another mile to the main mine complex," Hazel replied, consulting the map while keeping one eye on the surrounding forest. "But according to your intelligence, the caves should be closer, probably in that cluster of limestone formations to the southwest." Mape took out Martha's small brass spyglass and examined the mountainside above them. Through its lens, he could see smoke rising from multiple chimneys at the mine complex, along with a dark bulk of machinery and buildings scattered across a clearing that had been carved from the pine forest with brutal efficiency. "Guards," he reported, adjusting the focus to study the perimeter of the main facility. "At least 8 that I can see, probably more hidden from view. They're positioned to watch the main approaches, but they might have patrols in the forest as well." As he swept the spyglass across the terrain, searching for the limestone formations Martha had marked on her map, the sound of distant voices drifted down from somewhere above them. Men calling to each other in the rough accents of hired muscle, their words indistinct, but their tone suggesting routine rather than alarm. "Work detail," Hazel whispered, pointing toward a narrow trail that switchbacked up the steep slope above their position. "Probably bringing supplies to the caves or checking on the guards." Through the spyglass, Mape could see them now. 4 men moving single file along the trail, carrying what looked like food sacks and water barrels. They were armed, but not particularly alert, moving with the casual confidence of people who didn't expect trouble in their own territory. "Perfect," he said, collapsing the spyglass and returning it to his coat. "We follow them." The trail was steep and rocky, barely wide enough for a single horse in most places. But it was also well concealed by overhanging tree branches and natural rock formations, making it nearly invisible from any distance. They followed the supply detail at a safe interval, using the sound of their voices to maintain contact without risking detection. The men were talking as they climbed their conversation, carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Told Dutch we need more guards down there," one was saying. "Some of them girls been acting up lately trying to organize the others." "Which ones?" asked another voice. "That Indian girl mainly. The young one with the braids. She's been teaching the others some kind of hand signals like they're planning something." Mape felt his heart quicken. It sounded exactly like something Ayanna would do, turn her captivity into an opportunity to help the other prisoners. After another hour of climbing, the trail opened into a small clearing dominated by weathered limestone cliffs that rose like ancient monuments from the forest floor. The rock formations were riddled with natural caves and crevices carved by centuries of wind and water into shapes that seemed almost deliberately designed for concealment. But these weren't natural caves anymore. As they watched from the concealment of dense pine trees, Mape could see clear signs of human modification: iron bars set into several cave entrances, wooden platforms built outside others, and what looked like a well-worn path connecting the various openings. Most telling of all, he could see guards posted at strategic points around the clearing, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sunlight as they maintained watch over their rocky prison. "There," Hazel breathed, pointing toward one of the larger cave entrances. "Movement inside. People." Mape adjusted his position for a better view and felt his heart leap as he caught a glimpse of familiar dark hair through the iron bars. Even at this distance, even after months of separation, he knew his sister's silhouette as well as his own reflection. Ayanna was alive. Captive, but alive. But as he studied the defensive positions more carefully, Mape realized that rescuing her would be far more difficult than simply overpowering a few guards. The caves were positioned to be easily defensible with clear fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. Any direct assault would likely result in the deaths of the very people they were trying to save. "We need a distraction," he said finally. "Something to draw the guards away from the caves long enough for us to get inside and free the women." "What kind of distraction?" Hazel asked. Before he could answer, that distraction presented itself. From somewhere in the direction of the main mine complex, the sound of explosions began echoing across the mountainside. Not the controlled blasting of mining operations, but the irregular rhythm of combat. Through the spyglass, Mape could see smoke rising from multiple buildings at the mine, along with the tiny figures of men running back and forth in obvious panic. Whatever was happening up there, it was serious enough to draw attention away from the cave complex. "Now or never," Mape said, checking his weapons one final time. Deep within the largest cave, Ayanna sat in darkness, relieved only by the thin shafts of sunlight that filtered through the iron bars. Around her, 22 other women huddled in the shadows, their faces gaunt with malnutrition and etched with the kind of despair that came from months of hopeless captivity. But despair was not defeat, and Ayanna had spent her months of imprisonment doing more than simply surviving. She had been observing, learning, planning. The guards thought they were holding helpless victims, but they were wrong about at least one of their prisoners. In the small leather pouch concealed beneath her tattered dress, she carried more than just the ornament Mape had seen. She carried 3 months' worth of carefully documented evidence. Names, dates, financial transactions, descriptions of the network's operations that extended far beyond this single facility. All of it written in tiny script on whatever scraps of paper she could steal or improvise. But more importantly, she carried the components of a weapon. Mining operations required volatile materials, and over the months she had carefully gathered small amounts of lamp oil sulfur from matches and a piece of cloth treated with white phosphorus match scrapings, compounds used in blasting operations. Combined properly, they would create an incendiary device capable of causing significant confusion, exactly what would be needed when the moment came to act. "Listen," she whispered to the other women in the mixture of English-German and hand signals they had developed for covert communication. "The explosion's at the main mine. That's not an accident. Someone's coming for us." Frida, the German immigrant, who had been her closest ally during the long months of captivity, squeezed her hand. "How can you be sure?" "Because my brother promised he would find me," Ayanna replied with quiet confidence. "And he always keeps his promises." She could hear the guards outside talking nervously among themselves, clearly torn between their duty to watch the prisoners and their desire to know what was happening at the main facility. This was the opportunity she had been preparing for, the moment when all her planning would either pay off or get them all killed. "When I give the signal," she whispered, "everyone move to the back of the cave. Stay low, stay together, and be ready to run when the bars come down." They left the horses tied in the forest and approached the caves on foot, using the sound of distant battle to mask their movement through the rocky terrain. The guards they had observed earlier were clearly torn between their duty to watch the prisoners and their desire to know what was happening at the main facility. Two of them had already left their positions to get a better view of the smoke and explosions, leaving only a pair of sentries to watch over nearly 24 captive women. The first guard never knew what hit him. Moppy approached from behind, while the man was distracted by the distant battle, striking him unconscious with a precise blow to the base of the skull. The man crumpled silently to the rocky ground, his rifle clattering against the stone. The second guard turned at the sound of his companion hitting the ground, but Hazel was ready with her father's double-barreled shotgun. The weapon was steady in her hands, despite the pain from her lash wounds. "Drop the rifle," she ordered, her voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Slowly. The guard, a thin man with nervous eyes and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time underground, complied immediately. His hands shook as he set the weapon down. "Don't shoot, miss," he said, his voice cracking with fear. "I ain't looking for trouble, just doing a job." "Then you won't find any," Hazel replied, keeping the shotgun trained on his chest while Moppy secured his weapons. "Where are the keys to the cages?" "Boss keeps 'em," the guard replied, gesturing toward the main cave entrance. "But there's bolt cutters in the supply shed case of emergency." As Moppy went to retrieve the tools they would need to free the prisoners, Hazel kept watch on their captive guard while studying the cave complex more carefully. What she saw filled her with both hope and dread. There were indeed women inside the various caves. She could see them moving in the shadows beyond the iron bars, their faces pale and frightened, but alert. Some appeared to be in reasonably good health, while others showed signs of malnutrition and abuse that spoke of long months of harsh treatment. But there were also more guards than they had initially observed. And the sound of the distant battle was beginning to die away. If the distraction at the main facility was ending, they would have only minutes before the full security force returned to the caves. "Moppy," she called urgently. "We need to move faster." He emerged from the supply shed carrying a pair of heavy bolt cutters, his face grim with determination. "I know. Help me with these locks." The first cage they opened contained 6 women, all of them German or Scandinavian immigrants, based on their appearance and the few words of English they could manage. They were thin and frightened, but mobile, and alert enough to understand that rescue was at hand. The second cage held 8 more women of mixed backgrounds, including what appeared to be at least 2 Indians, besides his sister. And in the third cage, pressed against the bars, with desperate hope in her dark eyes, was Ayanna herself. "Brother," she said in Lakota as he worked to cut through the lock securing her prison. "I knew you would come." "Sister," he replied, feeling tears threaten for the first time since beginning this mission. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing that won't heal," she answered in English, stepping out of the cage with the fluid grace he remembered. At 16, she had grown taller during her months of captivity, but more importantly, she had developed the kind of inner strength that came from surviving the unthinkable. "How many guards?" he asked as they worked to free the remaining women. "Usually 8 during the day, 4 at night." Ayanna replied, helping to organize the freed prisoners into a group that could move quickly. "But they've been nervous for the past few days, talking about federal marshals and evidence. Some of the supervisors from the main mine have been coming down here for meetings." "What kind of meetings?" "Planning sessions," one of the other freed women said in accented English. This was Frida, the German immigrant who had been lured to America with promises of domestic work in a respectable household. "They talk about moving us, shipping us east before the authorities can find us." The implications were chilling. If Leopold's people were planning to relocate their entire operation, and this might be the last chance to rescue the women before they disappeared forever into the anonymous horror of urban slavery. But as they prepared to evacuate the cave complex, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the forest below. Someone was coming up the trail at a fast pace, and from the volume of sound, it wasn't just 1 or 2 riders. "Hide," Mape ordered, pushing the freed women back into the relative safety of the largest cave, while he and Hazel took defensive positions among the rocks. A dozen mounted men burst into the clearing, all heavily armed and moving with military precision. But these weren't federal marshals. They wore the rough clothing of mine workers and carried themselves with the casual brutality of hired killers. Leading them was a man Mape recognized from Martha's intelligence briefings, Dutch Miller, Leopold's chief of security, a former army sergeant who had been cashiered for excessive violence during the Indian Wars. "Spread out and secure the perimeter," Dutch ordered his men with military efficiency. "If there's federal marshals up here, I want to know about it. And check the cages, make sure none of our cargo has gone missing." As his men began to fan out through the clearing, Dutch approached the spot where their captive guard was still sitting with his hands bound. "Report," he demanded. "2 of them, Sarge," the guard replied nervously. "Indian and a white girl came up while you was dealing with the trouble at the main facility. They got the drop on me and Peterson before we knew what was happening." "Where are they now?" "Don't know, Sarge. Could be anywhere in these rocks." Dutch cursed creatively, then began issuing orders to his men with the efficiency of someone accustomed to tactical situations. Within minutes, they had established a perimeter around the cave complex and begun a systematic search of every hiding place large enough to conceal a person. From their position among the limestone formations, Mahpi could see that escape by the route they had used to approach was now impossible. Dutch's men had blocked the trail and posted sentries at every conceivable exit from the clearing. Worse, the freed women were trapped in the cave behind them, and it would only be a matter of minutes before the searchers discovered their hiding place. "The tunnel?" Ayanna whispered from somewhere in the darkness behind him. "There's a tunnel that connects to the main mine, hidden entrance at the back of the big cave." It was a desperate option, but better than remaining trapped in a defensive position that would inevitably be overrun. Mahpi signaled to Hazel, then began working his way back toward the cave entrance where the women were hidden. But as they prepared to retreat underground, Dutch himself appeared at the mouth of the cave, his rifle trained on the group of huddled prisoners. "Well, well," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Looks like our guests decided to visit the ladies after all. Come out where I can see you and maybe nobody gets hurt." There was no choice but to comply. Mahpi and Hazel emerged from their hiding places with their hands visible, though both kept their weapons within easy reach. "Drop the guns," Dutch ordered. All of them. Again, they had no choice but to obey. The Spencer carbine and shotgun clattered onto the rocky ground, followed by Mape's knife and a small derringer that Hazel had been carrying in her boot. "That's better," Dutch said, relaxing slightly, but keeping his rifle ready. "Now you two are going to walk nice and slow toward that tree over there where my boys can keep an eye on you while we figure out what to do next." But as they began to move in the direction he indicated, Ayanna made her own choice about what to do next. With a Lakota war cry that echoed off the surrounding cliffs, she launched herself at Dutch from the cave entrance, catching him completely off guard. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as they went down together, Ayanna clawing at his eyes while he tried to bring the weapon to bear on her. Other guards rushed toward the struggle, but their shots were wild and ineffective in the confusion. "The tunnel!" Mape shouted, grabbing his weapons from the ground, while Hazel did the same. "Everyone into the tunnel!" What followed was a running battle through the limestone caves and connecting passages with Dutch's men in pursuit, and the freed women caught between armed groups in the claustrophobic darkness underground. The tunnel system was more extensive than anyone had realized, with branches and side passages that led deeper into the mountain. The air grew thick and stale as they moved through the narrow passages, and the sound of gunfire echoed strangely off the stone walls. Behind them, they could hear Dutch's men shouting as they tried to navigate the unfamiliar terrain in near total darkness. But the tunnel system was also unstable, weakened by years of mining operations and natural erosion. As the gunfight continued through the underground maze, ceiling supports began to crack under the stress, and sections of tunnels started to show ominous signs of imminent collapse. "This way," Ayanna called, leading the group through a narrow passage that seemed to slope upward toward daylight. Behind them, they could hear Dutch's men shouting as portions of the tunnel system began to give way under the vibrations of their passage and the echoing gunshots. A section of ceiling collapsed just as the last of the group squeezed through the narrow opening, sealing off pursuit, but also cutting off their escape route. They were committed now to whatever lay ahead, with no possibility of retreat. The passage opened into another cave, this one larger than the prison chambers and with natural openings that provided both light and fresh air. But as they emerged into the space, blinking in the sudden brightness, they realized they weren't alone. Waiting for them in the cave were Leopold Strauss himself and half a dozen more guards, all armed and positioned to cover the tunnel entrance they had just used. "Welcome," Leopold said with cold politeness, his pale blue eyes so remarkably similar to Sheriff Tom's that the family resemblance was unmistakable, studying the group with obvious satisfaction. "I've been looking forward to meeting the people who have caused me so much inconvenience." Now the truth clicked into place for Mape. The unusual eye color, the coordinated corruption, the personal investment in protecting the criminal operation, Sheriff Tom Hadley was actually Tom Strauss Leopold's brother, operating under an assumed name to provide legal cover for the family business. "Surprised to see the family resemblance?" Leopold asked, noting Mape's expression with evident amusement. "My dear brother Thomas has been quite useful in his role as local law enforcement. It's amazing how much easier business becomes when you have the sheriff in your pocket, or rather, in your family." He gestured around the cave with proprietary satisfaction. "This little operation has been more successful than I ever imagined when I first arrived in this territory. The key you see is control of the trade, from capture to sale control, every aspect of the process, from procurement to final delivery." "You mean kidnapping and slavery?" Hazel said, her voice steady despite their desperate situation. "Such harsh words," Leopold replied with mock disappointment. "I prefer to think of it as providing employment opportunities for women who might otherwise have no prospects. Really, When you consider the alternatives available to these poor creatures, starvation, prostitution, death from exposure, what we offer is quite generous. Generous. Ayanna spoke for the first time since entering the cave, her voice carrying a note of barely controlled fury. You call holding women prisoner and forcing them to work without pay generous? Leopold turned his attention to her with obvious interest. Ah, the famous Ayanna. You've been quite troublesome during your stay with us. Not content with simply organizing resistance among the workers, you've been documenting our activities. Names, dates, financial transactions, quite a comprehensive record, I'm told. He stepped closer to her, his pale eyes gleaming with predatory interest. The question is whether that information exists only in your memory, or if you've been foolish enough to commit it to paper. If the latter, we'll need to recover those documents before we conclude our business here. Ayanna met Leopold's gaze without flinching. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't, Leopold replied pleasantly. But I think we can persuade you to remember. You see, I've found that people become remarkably cooperative when the lives of others hang in the balance. He nodded to his guards, who raised their rifles to cover the group of freed women huddled behind Mape and Hazel. So, here's my proposition. Leopold continued with the tone of a man making a reasonable business offer. You give me whatever evidence you've compiled, and I'll allow most of these women to live. Refuse and... well, dead witnesses tell no tales, do they? It was exactly the kind of impossible choice that Leopold specialized in, forcing people to choose between their own survival and the lives of innocents. But before anyone could respond, he gestured toward the cave entrance. However, before we proceed with negotiations, I should mention that not everyone in your little conspiracy has been as committed to justice as they pretended to be. A familiar figure emerged from the shadows at the cave entrance, and Mape's heart sank as he recognized Joseph Henley, the mild-mannered courthouse clerk who had supposedly been helping Martha gather evidence against the forged debt papers. Mr. Henley has been quite useful in keeping us informed of your activities, Leopold explained with obvious satisfaction. Amazing how much people will reveal when they think they're talking to a sympathetic ally. Joseph looked uncomfortable but determined as he joined Leopold's group. I'm sorry it came to this, he said, addressing Mape and Hazel directly. But you folks were stirring up trouble that was going to hurt a lot of innocent people. The mine employs half this territory, families, children, people who depend on steady wages to survive. Without Leopold's operations, whole communities would starve. It was the classic justification of collaboration, the greater good, requiring cooperation with evil. But it also revealed something Leopold might not have intended to share about the scope of his influence in the region. So, you've been reporting our plans from the beginning. Hazel said, her voice tight with anger and betrayal. Not from the beginning, Joseph replied defensively. But once it became clear you were planning something that could destroy the entire economic foundation of the region, I had to choose between personal loyalty and community welfare. Enough, Leopold interrupted. Ancient history. What matters now is the present situation and how we resolve it to everyone's satisfaction. But while Leopold had been talking, Mape had been counting guards, assessing positions, and looking for any advantage they might exploit. The cave was large enough to provide some room for maneuver, but Leopold's men had positioned themselves to cover all the obvious escape routes. However, there was something Leopold didn't know about Ayanna's time in captivity. She hadn't just been gathering evidence, she'd been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Before my sister gives you anything, Mape said, playing for time while he worked out the tactical situation, I want proof that you'll honor your word. What guarantee do we have that you won't kill us all, regardless of what we do? You have my word as a gentleman, Leopold replied with mock formality. The word of a man who kidnaps women and sells them into slavery, Hazel asked. Forgive me if that doesn't inspire confidence. Leopold's expression hardened, and for the first time, Mahpe could see the ruthless criminal beneath the cultured facade. Very well. No guarantees except this cooperate, and some of you might live. Refuse, and all of you will certainly die. Right here, right now. He raised his hand to signal his guards, but before he could give the order to fire, Ayanna moved. The leather pouch she had been concealing didn't contain just papers. It contained a small flask of what looked like lamp oil and a piece of white phosphorus match scrapings, treated cloth that would ignite on contact with rough surfaces. It was the kind of improvised incendiary device that could be made from materials available in any mining operation if you knew what you were doing and had the patience to gather the components over time. Everyone down. She shouted, striking the white phosphorus match scrapings against the cave wall and hurling the ignited flask toward Leopold's position. The cave erupted into chaos as the improvised bomb exploded in a burst of orange flame and choking black smoke, sending Leopold's guards diving for cover, while the freed women scattered toward whatever protection they could find among the rock formations. The acrid smell of burning oil filled the confined space, and the temperature rose noticeably from the flames. In the confusion, Mape tackled the nearest guard and wrestled his rifle away, while Hazel grabbed her shotgun from where it had been confiscated and swung it toward Leopold himself. But Leopold was faster and more agile than his civilized appearance suggested. Even as flames licked at his expensive coat, he drew a nickel-plated revolver, a .32 caliber Colt, with pearl grips, the kind of gentleman's weapon that was deadly effective at close range, and aimed it directly at Ayanna's chest. Enough! He roared over the chaos, his cultured accent slipping to reveal something harder and more dangerous underneath. Everyone freeze, or the girl dies. The standoff that followed was exactly what Mape had been trying to avoid, a direct confrontation with innocence caught in the crossfire. Leopold might be wounded and angry, but he was still rational enough to use hostages to his advantage. Drop your weapons! Leopold ordered, his revolver steady despite the burns on his hands from the improvised bomb. All of you. Now. For a moment, it seemed as if they would have no choice but to comply. Leopold had a clear shot at Ayanna, and his remaining guards were beginning to recover from the surprise attack, raising their rifles toward the huddled group of rescued women. But then, an unexpected voice spoke from the cave entrance, behind Leopold's position. I don't think so. Everyone turned to see Dutch Miller emerging from what should have been a blocked tunnel, his clothes torn and dusty from crawling through collapsed passages, but his rifle ready and aimed at Leopold's back. His face was grim with determination, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he had made a fundamental decision about which side he was on. Sorry, boss, Dutch said with grim satisfaction. But I signed on to guard prisoners and keep order not to murder women and children in cold blood, Hubbard, and time for you to find yourself a new security chief. The revelation sent shockwaves through Leopold's remaining men. If Dutch Miller, their leader and most trusted enforcer, was turning against the operation, what did that say about their own chances of survival? Several of them began to lower their weapons, clearly unwilling to continue fighting for a cause that their own commander had abandoned. You treacherous fool, Leopold snarled, spinning to face this new threat while keeping his revolver trained on Ayanna. You have no idea what you're doing. There are people in Chicago, New York, Washington who depend on this operation. Cross them, and you'll be dead within a month. I know exactly what I'm doing, Dutch replied calmly. I'm choosing the side that doesn't involve killing innocent people for money. Maybe I should have made this choice sooner, but better late than never. As Leopold swung his revolver toward Dutch, Mape saw his opportunity. He lunged forward, tackling Leopold around the waist and driving him to the rocky floor of the cave. The revolver discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, sending stone chips raining down on the combatants. What followed was a brutal hand-to-hand struggle between two men who knew that only one would walk away alive. Leopold was older than Mape, but desperate enough to fight with the fury of a cornered animal. They rolled across the cave floor, each trying to gain control of the fallen revolver, while the battle raged around them as Dutch's defection triggered a larger mutiny among Leopold's men. "You don't understand." Leopold gasped as they fought for the gun, his cultured mask slipping entirely to reveal the ruthless criminal beneath. "This is bigger than just me, bigger than this operation. There are networks across the entire frontier, connections that reach into the highest levels of government. Kill me, and you'll have the whole organization coming after you. Then we'll deal with them too." Mape replied, finally managing to wrench the revolver away from Leopold's grip. But Leopold wasn't finished. As Mape raised the weapon, Leopold pulled a small knife from his boot, a razor-sharp blade designed for close-quarters killing, and drove it toward Mape's ribs. Only Mape's quick reflexes saved him from a fatal wound. The blade sliced across his side, drawing blood, but missing anything vital. The injury was enough to momentarily stagger him, giving Leopold the chance to scramble toward another weapon that had been dropped during the fighting. But before he could reach it, Hazel's shotgun spoke with thunderous authority. The heavy load of buckshot took Leopold's center mass, lifting him off his feet and slamming him back against the cave wall with crushing force. He slid to the ground, his expensive clothes torn and bloody, his pale blue eyes already glazing over as life drained away. "That's for every woman you hurt," Hazel said quietly, working the action to chamber another shell. "And for my father, and for everyone else whose lives you destroyed." As the echoes of the blast died away, sudden silence fell over the cave. Leopold was clearly dead. Dutch had successfully convinced most of the guards to surrender their weapons, and the immediate threat was over. But even as they began to tend to wounds and organize the freed women for evacuation, Mape knew that Leopold's final words had been accurate. This victory, important as it was, represented only one battle in a larger war against organized crime that extended far beyond the Wyoming territory. "What now?" Ayanna asked, helping him bind the knife wound in his side with strips torn from her dress. "Now we get these women to safety," Mape replied, looking around at the faces of the people they had risked everything to save. "And then we figure out how to make sure this never happens again." As they prepared to leave the cave complex and begin the long journey back to Blue Rock, Dutch Miller approached with something that looked like a heavy ledger book in his hands. "Found this in Leopold's personal effects," he said, offering the book to Mape. "Looks like records of the whole operation, names, dates, financial transactions, connections to other operations throughout the territories. Might be useful if you're planning to take this fight to the next level." Mape accepted the ledger with grim satisfaction. Combined with the evidence Ayanna had gathered during her captivity, it would be enough to expose Leopold's entire network and bring federal authorities into the investigation with enough documentation to secure convictions. But as they made their way out of the caves and into the late afternoon sunlight, he found himself thinking less about the battles still to be fought and more about the people walking beside him. The partnership that had begun during those desperate moments at the whipping post had proven strong enough to survive the ultimate test. And looking into Hazel's green eyes as she helped organize the evacuation of the rescued women, Mape realized that his priorities had shifted fundamentally during the course of this mission. What had started as a quest to rescue his sister had become something larger, a commitment to building a future where justice was possible. and innocence could be protected. The evidence they carried would help bring down criminal networks throughout the territories. But more importantly, the bonds forged in danger and tested by fire would provide the foundation for something new and better in the place where they had chosen to make their stand. 6 months later, on a warm April morning in 1881, Mape stood on the front porch of what had once been the field house and was now the center of a growing ranch and workshop. The small farm had been expanded with the funds recovered from Leopold's operation into something unprecedented in the Wyoming Territory. A working ranch that also served as a refuge for women who had escaped from various forms of exploitation. The transformation had not been easy or quick. Through the long winter months, they had faced challenges that tested everyone's commitment to the vision they were building. Some of the rescued women had struggled with the psychological aftermath of their captivity, requiring patient counseling and medical care that went far beyond simple physical healing. Others had found the isolation and harsh weather of frontier life more difficult than they had expected, having come from urban environments where different survival skills were required. But most had thrived in ways that surprised even their most optimistic supporters. Frida had established a textile workshop that was already producing goods for sale in markets as far away as Denver, her European training in fine needlework proving valuable in an economy hungry for quality manufactured items. Liu Wei had opened a general store that served both the ranch and the growing town, while Ingrid had started a school that attracted students from homesteads throughout the valley. More importantly, they had created something that had never existed before. In this part of the territory, a community specifically designed to provide security and opportunity for women who had been marginalized or victimized by the traditional power structures of frontier society. Hazel had been elected sheriff by an overwhelming margin with authority to establish policies and hire deputies for the newly incorporated township. Her first official act had been to deputize Mahpe as her chief law enforcement officer, a position that allowed him to use his tracking and investigation skills while remaining rooted in the community they were building together. The partnership that had begun during those desperate days in October had deepened through the shared challenges of winter and the gradual process of turning vision into reality. What had started as mutual respect and tactical cooperation had evolved into something more personal and enduring, built on a foundation of proven trust and shared values. But they had taken their relationship slowly, mindful of the complex cultural and social dynamics involved in a union between a Lakota warrior and a frontier sheriff. Neither of their communities quite knew what to make of such an arrangement, and they had needed time to work out the practical details of building a life together while respecting both their heritage and their responsibilities. Ayanna had chosen to stay in Blue Rock through the winter, helping to establish programs for immigrant women while maintaining contact with their tribal band. She had found purpose in serving as a cultural bridge, helping newcomers understand American customs while also sharing Lakota perspectives on community responsibility and mutual support. Martha had used her detective skills to help federal authorities track down other nodes in Leopold's network, traveling throughout the territories to investigate reports of trafficking and exploitation. Her experience and the intelligence she had gathered over years of dangerous work had made her invaluable to the expanding federal effort to combat organized crime on the frontier. This morning was special for more personal reasons. Today was the day Mahpe and Hazel would formalize the partnership that had been growing between them since that first moment when he had stepped between her and the whip. The ceremony would be simple, an exchange of promises and symbols that represented their commitment to each other and to the work they had chosen to do together. Dr. Cormack had agreed to officiate, using a combination of legal formalities and personal vows that reflected their unique situation. Federal authorities had provided special recognition for the marriage, ensuring that their partnership would be legally binding, regardless of changing territorial laws or social prejudices that might arise in the future. As guests began arriving for the mid-morning ceremony, Mapi found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. 10 months ago, he had been a lone warrior, following a cold trail in search of his kidnapped sister. Now he was part of a family and community that extended far beyond blood relations to include people who had chosen to stand together in the face of impossible odds. The ceremony itself lasted only 20 minutes, but every word was carefully chosen and deeply felt. They exchanged rings that the local blacksmith had crafted from silver, mined in the nearby hills, simple bands that would wear well under the hard conditions of frontier life. They spoke vows that promised partnership rather than traditional domination, mutual support rather than rigid gender roles, and commitment to the community they were building together. When Dr. Cormack pronounced them husband and wife, according to territorial law and federal authority, the gathered witnesses erupted in cheers and applause that echoed across the valley. But for Mape and Hazel, the moment was quieter and more personal, a recognition of something that had been true for months now given official acknowledgement. The celebration that followed was equally heartfelt, but practical in the frontier tradition. The rescued women had contributed dishes representing their various cultural backgrounds, creating a feast that reflected the diversity of the community they were building. There was music provided by Ingrid's accordion and traditional songs sung by Ayanna and several tribal visitors who had come to witness their warrior's wedding to a white woman sheriff. But as the afternoon wore on and guests began to drift back to their own affairs, Mape and Hazel found themselves alone on the porch where this had all begun, watching the sun set over the river valley that had become their home. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him, with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "None," he replied honestly. "What about you?" "Only that Papa isn't here to see this," she said. "He would have liked you, I think, and he would have been proud of what we've accomplished." "He is here," Mape said, gesturing toward the land around them and the community they were building. "His work, his vision, his sacrifice. It's all part of what brought us together and what we're creating now." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they talked about their plans for the coming months and years. There would be challenges ahead. Criminal networks didn't disappear overnight, and building a just community on the frontier required constant vigilance and hard work. But they would face those challenges together as partners in every sense of the word. "What do you think happens next?" Hazel asked as they prepared to go inside and begin their first night as a married couple. "Next we live," Mapi replied, taking her hand as they crossed the threshold together. "We protect what we've built, we help it grow, and we make sure that what happened to those women never happens again. Not here, not anywhere, we have the power to prevent it." 1 year later, on a golden September morning, with the cottonwoods just beginning to turn and the air carrying the promise of a mild winter, their first child was born, a daughter they named Hope, in honor of the faith that had sustained them through the darkest times. Dr. Cormack delivered the baby in the same kitchen where they had planned their rescue mission, his experienced hands steady despite his advancing age. Martha served as midwife, her years of frontier living having prepared her for such moments, while Ayanna kept watch outside to ensure they wouldn't be disturbed during the crucial hours of labor. The birth was difficult, but not dangerous, and when Hope finally made her appearance in the world, she announced her arrival with lungs that suggested she would never have trouble making herself heard. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and from her first day, she displayed the kind of stubborn independence that seemed to run in both family lines. By then, Blue Rock had been transformed from a rough mining town into something unprecedented in the territory. A community that had been deliberately designed to provide opportunity and security for people who had been marginalized elsewhere. The population had grown to nearly 200, with new families arriving regularly to take advantage of the unique opportunities available. The textile workshop had expanded into a full manufacturing operation, producing goods that were sold throughout the territorial market. The school had attracted a normal school style lessons that drew students from across the frontier. And the ranch itself had become a model for sustainable agricultural practices that other communities were beginning to emulate. Most importantly, they had proven that it was possible to build a society based on justice and mutual respect, rather than exploitation and domination. Federal authorities were studying their methods with an eye toward replicating them in other areas, where criminal networks had been dismantled. On Hope's first birthday, as the family gathered on the same porch where Moppy had first intervened to stop a whipping Actingtown Marshal Hazelfield Many Horses, looked out over the valley that had become their home and marveled at how much had changed. The whipping post had been removed from the town square and replaced with a monument to the women who had died in Leopold's custody. The courthouse where corrupt officials had once held sway now housed legitimate courts that administered justice fairly regardless of gender, race, or economic status. And the hills where armed guards had once prevented escape now echoed with the laughter of children attending school and playing in safety. "Not bad for a year's work," Moppe observed, bouncing his daughter on his knee while she grabbed for his braided hair with determined fingers. "Not bad for a lifetime's work," Hazel corrected. "And we're just getting started." As the sun set behind the western ridges, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, 3 generations of their extended family settled in to plan the future and tell stories of the past. Outside, the Dakota wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of seasons yet to come. The frontier was still a challenging and sometimes dangerous place. But it was also a land of possibilities for those brave enough to seize them and strong enough to defend them. And in a ranch house beside Wind River, 2 people who had found each other through the worst of circumstances were proving that courage, determination, and love could indeed triumph over the forces of greed and corruption. They had built something lasting in a place where justice had seemed impossible. And they had created a future bright with promise for the daughter who would carry their legacy forward into whatever adventures the new century might bring.